somewhere beneath the sun-cracked earth of southeastern Turkey, buried under 20 feet of deliberately placed fill, there are rooms nobody was supposed to find. The corridors are cold, even in summer. The stones that line them weigh up to 20 tons each, carved with such precision that the chisel marks look intentional, almost surgical. Animals frozen mid-motion cover every surface. Foxes, vultures, scorpions, and presiding over all of it. That's two enormous T-shaped pillars standing nearly 20 feet tall, their arms extending outward like figures watching, waiting for something. These stones were put here over 11,000 years ago. And here is the detail that should stop you completely. According to everything we were taught about human history, the people who built this place should not have been capable of building it. Not even close. We have been told a story about where civilization begins. It goes like this. Around 6,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in the region we now call Iraq, a people called the Sumerians emerged from nowhere and invented everything. Writing, law, mathematics, agriculture, urban planning, the wheel, the calendar, organized religion. They did it seemingly overnight, with no evolutionary buildup, no slow progression, no clumsy early attempts. They just appeared, fully formed, already knowing things that should have taken millennia to develop. Already building cities that rivaled anything the ancient world would produce for thousands of years afterward. That's the official story. And if you are ready to explore why that story may be missing something so enormous, it rewrites everything, you are in exactly the right place. Stay until the end. Because what we are going to uncover gets stranger the deeper we go. Here is what the official story never asks. What if the Sumerians didn't invent civilization at all? What if they inherited it? What if everything we have attributed to their genius was actually a second attempt, a reconstruction, built on the ruins and the fragmented knowledge of something far older, something that was destroyed so completely that we have spent thousands of years misidentifying its debris as a beginning, when it was really a remnant? What if the miracle of Sumer was not a birth, but a memory? And what if that memory is pointing us towards something buried, submerged, and deliberately obscured? A chapter of human history so ancient it falls outside the range of our standard archaeological lens? Let's begin where the story officially starts. And then let's start pulling at the threads. The city of Eridu sits in the southern Iraqi desert, 24 kilometers southwest of a place called Nasiriyah. Today it looks like nothing. A low mound of crumbled mud brick rising from a flat, a featureless plain. But when archaeologists excavated this site in the 1940s and 50s, they found something that stopped them cold. Beneath the ruins of the Sumerian city they expected, there were older ruins. And beneath those ruins, older still. In total, the excavation team uncovered 18 distinct layers of settlement, one built directly on top of the other, each one reverent of whatever came before it. And as though every generation that lived here understood they were building on sacred ground. The Sumerians themselves called Eridu the first city. Not the first city they built, the first city in the world. Their most ancient texts describe it as the place where kingship descended from heaven, where civilization was handed down from the gods. Now, here is the problem with that. The oldest layer, at Eridu, dates to around 5,400 BCE. But the ruins, the artifacts, now the fragments of culture found in those layers, show something that should not be possible. The very first inhabitants of Eridu were already building temples, already worshipping, already organizing themselves around religious architecture. There is no period of fumbling, no experimental phase. They arrive at Eridu with a fully developed religious practice and a knowledge of monumental construction that appears to have no local origin. As some researchers point to this and ask the obvious question, where did they learn it? And the answer that archaeology has been quietly wrestling with for decades is this. They may have learned it from someone who came before. Before the Sumerians, there was a culture so enigmatic that archaeologists have struggled for over a century to explain it. They are called the Ubaid people. They dominated Mesopotamia, roughly between 5,500 and 3,700 BCE, building the foundations of every city that the Sumerians would later occupy, including Eridu itself. They created the earliest known examples of the type of mud brick architecture that would define Mesopotamian construction for millennia. They traded with distant peoples across what is now the Persian Gulf, establishing trade networks of extraordinary reach for their supposed level of development. In every measurable way, the Ubaid culture was too complex, too organized, too far-reaching for what our standard model says they should have been. But nothing about the Ubaid culture is stranger than what archaeologists found at a site called Al-Ubaid in the early decades of the 20th century. Mixed in among the pottery and the grain storage vessels and the ordinary artifacts of daily life were figurines, dozens of them. And these figurines are unlike anything else from the ancient world. They are humanoid in shape, 2 legs, 2 arms, a torso, a head. But the faces are unmistakably reptilian. Long, narrow skulls, almond-shaped eyes that bulge slightly, extended, tapered snouts. These are not people with animal headdresses on. These are not shamans in ritual masks. The reptilian features are the face itself, modeled with a care and a consistency that suggests these artists were depicting something they had actually seen, or something their culture held as profoundly real. Some of the figurines are female, and some appear to be nursing infants, holding lizard-headed babies to their chests in poses unmistakably tender, maternal, deliberate. No one has ever produced a satisfying explanation for what these figures represent. Some archaeologists suggest they may be ritual objects connected to a now-lost theology. Some researchers go further and suggest that these figurines may be depicting the beings from whom the Ubaid people believed they had received their knowledge, something pre-human, as something that came before. Could it be that the people who built the foundations of Sumerian civilization were themselves the inheritors of a tradition that stretched back beyond even them, into a period of human history we have never fully mapped? And if so, what were they remembering when they carved those strange, beautiful, unsettling faces? Here is where it gets genuinely strange. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt visited a hill in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. Other archaeologists had passed through the area before. They had noted the unusual limestone flints scattered across the surface and filed a report describing the site as medieval. Schmidt looked at it differently. He started digging. What he found there over the next 20 years of excavation would quietly detonate the foundation of everything historians had built their understanding of human origins upon. Schmidt would later describe what he uncovered with a phrase that entered the archaeological literature like a slow-burning fuse. First came the temple, then the city. Göbekli Tepe is a temple complex in southeastern Turkey, near the city of Şanlıurfa, sitting at the top of a ridge that overlooks the plains of the Fertile Crescent. It is at least 11,500 years old, with some recent analyses pushing portions of the site back toward 13,000 years. For context, Stonehenge is approximately 5,000 years old. The Egyptian pyramids at Giza date to around 4,500 years ago. Göbekli Tepe predates both of them so dramatically that when you try to place them on the same timeline, the pyramids look almost modern. It is without any serious archaeological dispute the oldest monumental architecture ever discovered on Earth. And the people who built it, according to everything we know, should not have been able to build it. Picture the site as it might have looked in those early millennia before the last of its builders buried it under thousands of tons of fill. You are standing on a hilltop in what would become the most important cradle of agriculture in human history. The air is cool, carrying the smell of limestone dust and the distant scent of the cedar forests that would one day be stripped from these hills by Bronze Age logging. Around you, arranged in precise circles, are T-shaped pillars carved from single blocks of limestone. Some stand nearly 20 feet high, some weigh up to 20 tons. On their surfaces, vast animals have been etched and chiseled with a skill that would not appear again in the archaeological record for thousands of years. Not crude scratch marks on stone, but genuinely accomplished relief sculpture, with depth and perspective and the kind of anatomical understanding that normally takes generations of artistic tradition to develop. Foxes pour down one pillar in an almost flowing composition. A vulture spreads enormous wings across what researchers have come to call Pillar 43, the vulture stone. Serpents intertwine around column bases. And at the center of each enclosure, two tall central pillars face each other, their T-shaped tops carved into what most researchers agree are stylized human forms: shoulders, arms, hands. Abstract figures of enormous size watching over whatever rites were performed in the spaces between them. Who built this? And the standard answer is hunter-gatherers. People who had not yet discovered agriculture, had not yet built permanent settlements, had not yet developed any of the social infrastructure that we associate with civilization. And yet they somehow quarried, transported, shaped, and erected stones of 20 tons on a hilltop using only stone tools. They somehow organized a labor force of hundreds of workers, fed and housed them for years, maintained the construction effort across multiple generations. That they somehow developed a sculptural tradition of genuine sophistication that leaves us with no evidence of a learning curve, no crude early attempts, no progression from simple to complex. Göbekli Tepe appears in the record complete, accomplished, fully realized. And then something even more puzzling happened. Between 9,000 and 8,000 years ago, whoever was responsible for Göbekli Tepe deliberately buried it, not abandoned it, not simply walked away. They intentionally filled the enclosures with thousands of tons of refuse, animal bones, stone tools, crushed artifacts, packing the site into a seamless mound that would remain undisturbed for 11,000 years. Why? Why bury something so massive, so clearly sacred, with such deliberate care? What were they hiding? Or what were they preserving? Some researchers believe the burial was an act of reverence, sealing the site so it could not be desecrated or repurposed. And others have suggested something darker, that the site was sealed because whatever it represented had become dangerous, that what it contained, symbolically, astronomically, perhaps structurally, needed to be put away, locked inside the earth, kept from those who might misuse it. And here is where Pillar 43 enters the story in a way that should make you sit up straighter. In 2017, researchers from the University of Edinburgh published a study arguing that the carvings on the vulture stone at Göbekli Tepe were not decorative. They were astronomical. Specifically, the researchers argued that the arrangement of animals and symbols on Pillar 43 encodes a star map, a depiction of the constellations as they appeared on a specific date. And when they ran the astronomical calculations backward, factoring in the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, known as precession, thus they arrived at a date, approximately 10,950 BCE. The builders of Göbekli Tepe, they concluded, had carved into stone a memorial to a specific night in history, a catastrophic night. Because according to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, roughly 12,900 years ago, one of the most devastating events in the history of human civilization struck the Earth. An enormous fragment, or fragments, mass of a comet or asteroid struck the North American ice sheet and possibly multiple other locations simultaneously, triggering instant and catastrophic climate change. The temperatures plunged. The megafauna died. The ice sheets, already weakening, began releasing water into the oceans at a rate that would raise sea levels by approximately 120 meters over the following several thousand years. And if some form of organized human civilization existed at that moment, coastal, temperate, sophisticated in ways we have not yet uncovered, that civilization would have been destroyed. Not gradually, catastrophically, almost overnight. What if Göbekli Tepe was built by survivors? What if the people who erected those pillars were the remnant of something far older, carrying forward the fragments of a knowledge tradition that had nearly been extinguished, building their memorial on a hilltop precisely so it would survive whatever came next? What if the deliberate burial was not about hiding from enemies, but about preservation across an interval of darkness, sealing their knowledge against a future they feared might also be chaos? Consider the timeline. The Younger Dryas event begins around 12,900 years ago. Göbekli Tepe is built, beginning around 11,500 years ago, roughly 1,000 years after the catastrophe. It is then deliberately buried around 9,000 to 8,000 years ago. And approximately 5,000 years after that burial, a civilization appears in Mesopotamia with no apparent precursor, already knowing how to write, already knowing how to organize complex society, already possessing a cosmology, a theology, and a set of origin stories in which their knowledge was handed down by supernatural beings who came from beyond the sky. The Sumerian king list is one of the most extraordinary documents in the ancient world. It is a clay tablet, 4,000 years old, currently housed at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England. It is a list of rulers written in Sumerian cuneiform that begins in a very strange place. Before the flood, it reads, before the great catastrophe that reshaped the world, 8 kings ruled over the cities of Sumer. And the reigns described for these pre-flood kings are not normal human lifetimes. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, is listed as having reigned for 28,800 years, and his successor reigned for 36,000 years. The total combined reign of the 8 pre-flood kings amounts to 241,200 years. And then a single line breaks the record. Then the flood swept over the earth. After which, the list begins again with kings who have recognizably human lifespans. For over a century, historians have treated these reigns as obvious mythology, symbolic numbers representing divine kings who could not have actually lived so long. And perhaps they are right, but consider a different possibility. What if the Sumerian scribes who compiled that list were not recording individual human lifespans at all? What if they were recording something else? The duration of a pre-flood era, the age of a civilization that predated their own by hundreds of thousands of years, as encoded in a numerical system their civilization had inherited but no longer fully understood. What if those impossible numbers are a garbled memory, accurate in its insistence that something enormous existed before the flood, even if the specific figures have been warped beyond literal meaning by the passage of time? Because here's what makes this question genuinely urgent. It is not just the Sumerians who remember a flood. Thus, the story of a catastrophic deluge that destroyed a previous age of the world appears in over 200 separate cultural traditions across every inhabited continent. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the biblical book of Genesis and describes an almost identical flood story with almost identical details. the Hindu texts, which describe a flood sent by the gods to destroy a corrupt previous world age, the Greek myths of Deucalion, the Mesoamerican accounts of world destruction by water, the Aboriginal Australian stories of the flooding of the coastal lands. Even the Norse tradition's Ragnarok contains an element of the world being swallowed by rising water. These are not the same stories spread by cultural diffusion. Many of them developed in complete isolation from each other. They are different cultures, different continents, different languages, different cosmologies, all independently remembering the same thing. So what if all of them are right? Here is a fact so significant that it tends to get buried in geology papers rather than history books. At the peak of the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels were approximately 120 meters, that is nearly 400 feet, lower than they are today. That means the coastlines of the ancient world bore no resemblance to the coastlines we see on modern maps. The Persian Gulf was dry land. The Indian subcontinent extended hundreds of miles further into the sea. Britain and Europe were the same continent. Southeast Asia was a vast landmass connecting islands that are now separated by ocean. And beginning roughly 14,600 years ago, with the melting of the great ice sheets, all of that land began disappearing. Not slowly, sometimes catastrophically. Entire coastlines submerged over the span of single generations. Valleys flooded in days. In islands vanished within lifetimes. And the people who lived there, the coastal peoples who, as today, would have settled near the water for food, trade, and access, would have been swept away with them. Picture what it would mean to live through that. You are born on a coastal plain that your grandparents still remember as abundant. Shallow waters, warm climate, easy fishing, the beginning of what might have been a thriving settlement. By the time you have children, the water is closer. By the time you have grandchildren, the land your grandparents described is under the sea. And your grandchildren will tell their grandchildren about it. And their grandchildren will tell theirs. The story will survive for thousands of years, after the physical evidence has sunk beneath 120 meters of ocean, far beyond the reach of any Bronze Age archaeologist. In December of 2000, sonar equipment scanning the seafloor of the Gulf of Kambat, off the northwestern coast of India, detected something impossible: massive underwater structures. Organized grid-like formations of what appeared to be streets and buildings. Artifacts were recovered from the site: wood, pottery, stone tools. Carbon dating placed some of the recovered material at 9,500 years old, predating the known Harappan civilization by thousands of years. Some researchers have called this the ruins of an ancient city drowned by the rising sea at the end of the Ice Age. Others have contested the methods and the interpretation, but the formations are there. You can find the sonar data. You can read the Indian government's own official reports on the discovery. What no one has satisfactorily explained is why, if these are natural formations, they display the geometric regularity of streets and building foundations. The same question haunts a set of structures off the southern coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni. In 1986, a local diver discovered a formation of stepped stone platforms descending from the seafloor in a way that looks unnervingly like the work of human hands. The Yonaguni Monument, as it came to be called, features what appear to be right-angled cuts, terraced levels, and structural regularity that Japanese marine geologist Masaki Kimura spent years documenting and arguing is man-made. Kimura dated the structure to at least 5,000 years old on the basis of stalactites found in underwater caves nearby that would have required the caves to have been above water to form. Other researchers suggest the structure could be natural, the result of the way this particular type of sandstone fractures along regular plains. But here's the question nobody can fully answer. If this is natural, Why does it look like every stepped pyramid that human civilization has ever independently designed, on every continent, across every culture, in every era? Is it coincidence that the same shape appears in Mesopotamia, in Central America, in Southeast Asia, in the Andes, and here, submerged, off the coast of an island in the Pacific? Or is there a common origin, a template, a tradition, a teacher? Maybe there is an argument to be made that the most important evidence for a lost civilization may not be what we have found, but what we know was there and cannot find. Consider the ancient copper mines of Lake Superior in the Great Lakes region of North America. Archaeological evidence shows that someone was extracting copper from mines around Lake Superior on an industrial scale, beginning approximately 5,000 years ago and possibly earlier. The copper was high-grade, nearly pure, and enormous in quantity. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 500,000 tons and 1.5 billion pounds of copper was taken from these mines across roughly 1,800 years of activity. The mines themselves still exist. You can visit them. The primitive stone tools left behind by the miners are real and have been carbon dated. But here is the mystery that no one has resolved. Where is the copper? All archaeologists have found virtually no evidence that the known Native American cultures of the Great Lakes region used copper on anywhere near the scale that would account for what was extracted. The copper is gone, somehow, somewhere, in quantities that suggest something very large was making very heavy use of it. For what? And by whom? And then there is the map. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Piri Reis compiled a world map from what he described as source maps he had collected. Maps, he wrote, dating back to the time of Alexander the Great, and possibly older. The map, which still exists and can be examined in Istanbul, is remarkable for many reasons. Among them, it shows an accurate outline of South America, at a time when Europeans had barely begun to map its eastern coast. It shows the Falkland Islands, which would not be officially discovered for another generation. And at the southern edge, it shows a landmass that some researchers believe represents Antarctica, not as it appears today, buried under a mile of ice, but as it would have appeared with its coastline exposed. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1818. The idea that anyone in 1513 should have had accurate coastal mapping of a continent buried under glacial ice is, strictly speaking, impossible. Unless the source maps Piri Reis was compiling were far older than he indicated. Unless someone had mapped that coastline before the ice came. And unless that someone had a level of navigational and cartographic sophistication that we have no explanation for. Some researchers believe there was once a period, long before recorded history, when the ice was thinner, the sea was lower, and a civilization operating at a scale we have not yet detected was mapping the world. And that it was this civilization, whatever it was, wherever it was centered, that built the tradition later encoded in Göbekli Tepe, remembered in the Sumerian king list, mourned in every flood myth from every corner of the earth. And that the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Indus Valley people, the megalith builders of Europe and South America, were not the first act. They were the reconstruction. They were the civilization that emerged in the ruins, preserving what fragments they could of something the catastrophe had nearly consumed entirely. Across the Atlantic, high in the Bolivian Andes, at an altitude of nearly 13,000 feet on the shores of Lake Titicaca, there is a city called Tiwanaku, sometimes spelled Tiahuanaco. The mainstream archaeological consensus dates its peak occupation to between 500 and 1000 CE. But a Bolivian archaeologist named Arthur Poznansky, working in the early 20th century, conducted a detailed astronomical analysis of the site's ceremonial structures, specifically its orientation to the solstice sunrise, and concluded that the alignments could only have been geometrically accurate at a specific point in the distant past, when the tilt of the Earth's axis was different from today. His calculations suggested the original construction was not 1,500 years old, but 17,000 years old. Yet mainstream archaeology rejected his methodology and his conclusions. But his measurements have never been fully disproved, and the anomalies he identified in the astronomical alignments have never been fully explained. What is beyond dispute is that Tiwanaku features engineering sophistication that should not exist at that altitude, with that level of resource access. Massive stone blocks fitted together without mortar to tolerances of millimeters, on a hydrological system that efficiently managed water across the entire site, and a symbolic vocabulary carved into the gateway of the sun, whose full meaning has never been decoded. Could it be that Tiwanaku, Göbekli Tepe, the submerged city off the coast of India, and the Yonaguni monument are not separate, unrelated mysteries? Could it be that they are all fragments of the same broken picture, artifacts of a civilization or a network of civilizations, that existed before the catastrophe and were wiped so thoroughly from the record that we have spent the last century mistaking their ruins for anomalies? Consider this. In 360 BCE, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, describing a powerful island civilization he called Atlantis. He placed its destruction at approximately 9,600 BCE. He described it as larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, is situated beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Most classicists have dismissed Atlantis as philosophical allegory, and that may well be the correct interpretation. But Plato was writing 4,000 years after the end of the Younger Dryas, and the date he gives for the destruction of Atlantis, 9,600 years before his writing, falls almost precisely at the end of the most catastrophic climate event in human prehistory. The date is not wrong. The geology matches. The timing is exact. Whether or not Plato was describing a literal island civilization, his date for the flood and the destruction is, by sheer calculation, remarkably accurate. Some researchers believe there is no coincidence here. That Plato had access to an oral tradition or to older written records that preserved the cultural memory of the Younger Dryas catastrophe. That the story of Atlantis, like the stories of Gilgamesh, of Noah, of Manu, and of Deucalion, is a distorted but structurally accurate memory of something real that happened when the ice melted and the sea swallowed the world. And that the reason we have never found the physical evidence of that earlier civilization is the simplest possible reason. It is under 120 meters of water, on continental shelves that modern archaeology has barely begun to survey. Here is a number that should arrest you. Approximately 70% of the Earth's continental shelves, the shallow underwater platforms that ring the continents and represent the terrain where human settlement would most naturally have occurred, have never been archaeologically surveyed. We have better maps of the far side of the moon than we have of the ocean floor in most coastal regions. What if the answer is not that no civilization existed before Sumer, but that we have simply not yet looked in the right place? What if an entire chapter of human history is sitting in the dark at the bottom of the sea, perfectly preserved in the cold, anaerobic water, waiting for the technology and the will to find it? Researchers who study ancient flood myths, including scholars at institutions like the University of Bradford, who have been reconstructing the lost world of Doggerland, an entire country, the size of modern England, that connected Britain to mainland Europe and was swallowed by the North Sea roughly 8,000 years ago, have begun to take seriously the idea that the memory of pre-flood civilizations is not purely mythological. The archaeological evidence from Doggerland's submerged landscape already shows sophisticated settlement patterns, tool traditions, and cultural complexity far beyond what we associate with Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. What lies beneath the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean shelf, out of the Yellow Sea, the Aegean Basin, regions that were all substantially dry land during the Ice Age, is almost entirely unknown. And so we return to Göbekli Tepe, to those silent T-shaped pillars, watching from a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, buried by hands that understood they were preserving something for a future that might need it. The lead archaeologist, Klaus Schmidt, excavated the site for 20 years before his death in 2014. He uncovered approximately 5% of the total structure. The rest remains underground, sealed. Somewhere beneath that hill, in unexcavated enclosures, are stones and carvings and symbols we have not yet seen. And in 2022, archaeologists announced the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, a site in Mardin province, Turkey, about 12,000 years old, 1,000 years older than Göbekli Tepe. And Karahan Tepe, 45 kilometers away, may be older still. With every new site, the edge of the unknown moves further back. The beginning of complexity retreats into deeper time. And the question that haunted Klaus Schmidt, that haunts every archaeologist who has stood inside those enclosures and looked up at those carved stones, grows louder. What came before this? So what are we left with? We are left with a civilization that appeared in Mesopotamia 6,000 years ago with knowledge it should not have possessed. It built on the foundations of a culture called the Ubaid that itself appeared from nowhere, leaving behind reptilian figurines that nobody can explain. We are left with a temple complex in Turkey that is 11,500 years old, built by people who had no agriculture, no cities, no pottery, and yet somehow the ability to organize large-scale construction and produce sophisticated sculpture. We are left with a king list that insists, in the most ancient writing we possess, that something enormous existed before the flood. We are left with over 200 independent cultural traditions, all independently remembering the same catastrophe. We are left with geological evidence of a cataclysm 12,900 years ago that could have destroyed any coastal civilization that existed at that time. We are left with submerged ruins off the coasts of India and Japan that have not been satisfactorily explained as natural formations. We are left with hundreds of millions of tons of missing copper. And we are left with a Turkish cartographer who, in 1513, possessed the outline of a continent that should not have been discoverable for another 3 centuries. The mainstream explanation for all of this is that it is coincidence, chance, or misinterpretation, or mythology taken too literally. That Sumer really was the first, and everything before it was simply hunter-gatherers making increasingly complex art. Yet that the flood myths are natural responses to local flooding events, not memories of a global catastrophe. That the reptilian Ubaid figurines are ritual objects whose religious context was simply never recorded. That Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe is an ancient hunting scene, not an astronomical disaster memorial. That the Gulf of Combat structures are natural sedimentary formations, not sunken streets. But there are those who look at all of this and ask a different question. It's not whether any single piece of evidence is proof, no single piece is, but whether the pattern itself means something. Whether a civilization that left no writing, no cities, no structures that would survive 12,000 years underwater, but did leave memories in every culture on Earth and fragments of knowledge in the oldest sites we know, is less visible to us precisely because we have been looking for the wrong kind of evidence in the wrong kind of place. Is it possible that the greatest archaeological discovery in human history is not waiting to be found in the desert, but is sitting in the dark beneath 120 meters of cold water, waiting for us to finally look? Is it possible that we are not, as we have always assumed, the inheritors of Sumer, but the inheritors of something that Sumer itself was trying to remember? We may never know for certain. The ocean keeps its secrets well. The catastrophe was thorough, and time, then, as it always does, has had the final word on most of what came before. But something about the sheer weight of these mysteries, their convergence, their persistence, their refusal to fit neatly inside the story we have told ourselves, suggests that the story is not finished. That somewhere, in a sealed enclosure under a Turkish hilltop, or in cold sediment on a submerged Indian shelf, or encoded in a king list written on a 4,000-year-old clay tablet, the answer is waiting. Well, not to be invented, just to be found. What do you think really happened 12,000 years ago? What was destroyed when the ice melted and the seas rose? Share your thoughts in the comments, because this is one of those mysteries where the most important insights might come from you. And until we meet again, keep your minds open and stay curious.